For 27 years, Nelson Mandela lived behind prison walls. Outside, South Africa kept moving. Children grew up. Families endured apartheid. Hope faded for some and grew stronger for others. The country waited, not knowing how its story would end. This is the long walk of Nelson Mandela. The story of one man, a nation divided, and the ordinary people who lived through one of history's greatest struggles for freedom. At the African Archive, we bring Africa's history to life through the people who lived it. If you enjoy thoughtful, well-researched documentaries like this, please subscribe and join us as we uncover the stories that shaped our continent. Before Nelson Mandela became the face of a movement, he was a young boy growing up in a small village. And that is where our story begins. Chapter 1. Before the long walk. Long before the world knew the name Nelson Mandela, life moved at its own steady pace in the rolling hills of South Africa's Eastern Cape. As the sun rose over the green valleys, cattle grazed on open grasslands while shepherds guided them toward fresh pasture. Women fetched water from nearby streams and prepared morning meals over open fires. Children ran barefoot along winding paths before joining their families in the work of the day. Life was shaped by the land. Families raised cattle, planted maize, and depended on the changing seasons. Elders gathered beneath the shade of trees to settle disputes and share stories passed down through generations. Respect for family, tradition, and community guided everyday life. The villages were quiet, but they were not isolated. Travelers brought news from distant towns. Traders carried goods between communities. Christian missionaries had established schools and churches in many parts of the Eastern Cape, while long-held African customs remained an important part of daily life. Many families balanced both worlds, embracing new ideas without forgetting their own traditions. Yet beyond the hills, South Africa was changing. Gold and diamonds had transformed the country's economy. Mines drew thousands of African men away from their homes, often for months at a time. New towns grew rapidly, while laws increasingly controlled where black South Africans could live, work, and travel. For many families, these changes were deeply personal. Fathers left home to work in distant mines. Mothers carried greater responsibilities at home. Children grew up with long periods of separation from their parents. The opportunities created by the country's wealth were not shared equally. And many black South Africans found their choices limited by laws they had no part in making. Even so, ordinary life continued. Children laughed as they played in open fields. Weddings brought families together in celebration. Harvest festivals marked the changing seasons. In the evenings, stories were told around the fire, reminding each new generation of the values, history, and traditions of the Tembu people. It was into this world that Nelson Ralilela Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvizo. He belonged to the Tembu royal family through his father's lineage. But his childhood was far from one of luxury. After his father's death, Mandela was raised in the village of Kunu, where he herded cattle, attended a local mission school, and learned the customs and responsibilities of his community. Years later, Mandela would remember those days with great affection. He recalled the freedom of the countryside, the lessons of the elders, and the sense of belonging that shaped his earliest understanding of leadership and justice. At the time, he was simply another village boy with dreams that had not yet taken shape. No one could have known that the child running across those green hills would one day become the face of South Africa's struggle for freedom. But beyond the quiet villages of the Eastern Cape, the country was changing. The laws that divided people by race were becoming stronger. Before long, they would shape not only Mandela's life, but the lives of millions of South Africans. And the long walk was about to begin. Chapter 2. Finding his voice. As Nelson Mandela grew older, the world beyond his village became impossible to ignore. South Africa was changing quickly. Cities were growing as thousands of black South Africans left their homes to work in mines, factories, and railways. They helped build the country's economy. But many lived under laws that limited where they could live, where they could work, and even where they could travel. Mandela's own journey took him far from the quiet hills of the Eastern Cape. After attending mission schools, he studied at the University College of Fort Hare, one of the few places where black students could receive higher education. There, he met young men and women who believed South Africa could become a country where everyone had equal rights. His time at Fort Hare did not last long. After becoming involved in a student protest, Mandela left the university before completing his studies there. Soon afterward, he traveled to Johannesburg, a city unlike anything he had known before. Johannesburg was full of opportunity, but it was also full of inequality. The streets were busy with workers from every part of the country. Gold mines operated day and night, drawing wealth from the earth. Yet the people doing much of the hardest work earned little and had few rights. Black families were often forced to live in overcrowded townships, while many better neighborhoods were reserved for white South Africans. Mandela found work and continued his education. He studied law while working during the day. In time, he qualified as a lawyer and, together with Oliver Tambo, opened one of the first black-owned law firms in South Africa. Many of their clients were ordinary people facing unfair laws, forced removals, or restrictions on where they could live and work. Each case revealed the same pattern. The law was not treating all South Africans equally. In 1948, a new chapter began when the National Party came to power. The government introduced apartheid, a system of laws that separated people by race and gave white South Africans nearly all political power. New laws controlled where people could live, whom they could marry, where they could go to school, and even which entrances they could use in public places. For millions of black South Africans, daily life became even more restricted. Families were separated by past laws. Communities were moved from land they had lived on for generations. Opportunities became harder to find. And speaking out against the government carried serious risks. Mandela believed change would require people to work together. He joined the African National Congress, known as the ANC, and became one of the founders of its youth league. The group encouraged peaceful protest, public campaigns, and mass action against unjust laws. Mandela quickly became known as a disciplined organizer and a powerful speaker who believed South Africans could shape a different future. His voice was growing stronger, but so was the government's determination to silence those demanding equality. The struggle that had begun in courtrooms, churches, and public meetings would soon move into the streets. And Nelson Mandela would find himself at the center of it. Chapter 3. The Road to Robben Island. By the early 1950s, the call for equality could no longer be ignored. Across South Africa, thousands of ordinary people joined peaceful protests against apartheid. Workers, teachers, students, church leaders, and community members stood together to challenge laws they believed were unjust. They marched, held meetings, and refused to obey certain apartheid rules, knowing they could be arrested. Nelson Mandela became one of the movement's best-known leaders. He traveled across the country, helping organize campaigns and encouraging people to stand together despite their differences. His message was simple. South Africa belonged to all who lived in it, regardless of race. The government answered with arrests. Police broke up meetings, banned political gatherings, and detained activists. Many leaders, including Mandela, were arrested during the Defiance campaign. Although they were later released, the government continued to watch their every move. Still, the movement continued to grow. In 1955, representatives from different communities gathered in Kliptown to adopt the Freedom Charter, a document that declared that South Africa belonged to all its people and called for equal rights. While Mandela was unable to attend because of government restrictions, the charter became one of the most important statements of the anti-apartheid movement. The government's response became even harsher. In 1956, Mandela and more than 150 other activists were arrested and charged with treason. The trial lasted for several years before they were found not guilty in 1961. During those years, many activists spent as much time in courtrooms as they did organizing for change. Then came a turning point. On March 21, 1960, Police opened fire on a peaceful protest against the passed laws in the township of Sharpeville. 69 people were killed, and many more were injured. The event shocked South Africa and drew international attention to apartheid. After Sharpeville, the government banned the African National Congress. Peaceful protests became increasingly difficult to organize. Many activists believed the political space for nonviolent resistance was disappearing. In 1961, Mandela helped establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation. The organization carried out acts of sabotage against government buildings and infrastructure, while seeking to avoid the loss of life. Mandela later explained in court that this decision came after years of peaceful protest had failed to bring change. It marked a major turning point in the struggle against apartheid. Mandela soon began traveling secretly within South Africa and abroad. He met leaders in other African countries, sought support for the anti-apartheid movement, and received military training. Because he moved from place to place without being easily found, newspapers gave him a new name. They called him the Black Pimpernel. But the search for him was closing in. In August 1962, Mandela was arrested by South African police. He was later convicted of leaving the country without permission and encouraging workers to strike. While serving that sentence, police discovered documents linking him and other ANC leaders to Umkhonto we Sizwe. In 1963, Mandela and his fellow activists stood trial once again. This time, the charges were far more serious. The courtroom would become the stage for one of the most powerful speeches of his life. And when the trial ended, the road ahead would lead not to freedom, but to a prison island in the Atlantic Ocean. Chapter 4. 27 years. The courtroom fell silent. On April 20, 1964, during the Rivonia trial, Nelson Mandela stood before the court and explained why he had fought against apartheid. Near the end of his statement, he spoke words that would be remembered around the world. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. 2 months later, Mandela and 7 of his co-accused were found guilty of sabotage. Instead of receiving the death penalty, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. For many South Africans, it felt as though a door had closed. One of the country's most recognizable leaders had disappeared behind prison walls. Many wondered whether they would ever see him again. Mandela was taken to Robben Island, a prison surrounded by the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean. There, he and other political prisoners lived in small cells with very few possessions. They followed strict routines, performed hard physical labor in a limestone quarry, and lived under prison rules that controlled almost every part of their daily lives. Outside the prison, life did not stand still. Children who had been born the year Mandela was imprisoned began school. Those children grew into young adults while he remained behind bars. Families continued to live under apartheid, facing forced removals, passed laws, unequal schools, and limited opportunities. The struggle also continued. Across South Africa, students, workers, church leaders, and community organizations kept demanding change. Many were arrested. Some lost their lives. Others continued the work quietly, believing that freedom was worth the sacrifice. Around the world, support for the anti-apartheid movement grew stronger. Countries imposed sanctions. Musicians, athletes, students, and activists called for Mandela's release. His name became known far beyond South Africa, even though he could not speak freely to the world himself. Inside prison, Mandela remained a symbol of resilience. He continued to study, read, and work alongside other prisoners. Over the years, prison officials eased some restrictions, allowing him limited visits from family members and carefully monitored correspondence. Even in prison, he remained an important figure in the struggle against apartheid. As the 1980s drew to a close, South Africa was under growing pressure. Violence had increased. The economy was struggling. International criticism was mounting. And many leaders believed the country could not continue on its current path. Quiet talks began between government officials and Mandela. At first, few people knew they were happening. But they marked the beginning of a new chapter. After nearly 3 decades in prison, The possibility of freedom no longer seemed impossible. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked through the gates of Victor Verster prison. Millions watched on television. Others gathered around radios. Across South Africa, families stopped what they were doing to witness a moment they had waited 27 years to see. The prisoner had walked free. But the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Could a nation divided for generations learn to live together? Chapter 5. A New Beginning. When Nelson Mandela walked out of prison, South Africa celebrated. But freedom for one man did not mean freedom for the whole nation. Apartheid was still the law of the land. Communities remained divided by race. Violence continued in many parts of the country. And years of fear and mistrust could not disappear overnight. For ordinary South Africans, the future was uncertain. Many hoped that change had finally come. Others worried that the country might fall into civil war. Families who had lived apart for generations wondered if they could one day share the same neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces as equals. Mandela called for calm. In his first public speeches after his release, he thanked those who had continued the struggle and urged South Africans to work toward a peaceful future, while he remained committed to ending apartheid. He also spoke about reconciliation and the need to build a country that belonged to everyone. The years that followed were filled with difficult negotiations. Leaders from the African National Congress, the South African government, and other political parties met again and again to discuss how the country could move from apartheid to democracy. Progress was often slow, and violence continued to claim lives in several communities. Even so, many people refused to give up hope. Churches held prayer meetings. Community leaders encouraged dialogue. Neighbors who had once lived in fear began imagining a different future for their children. Across the country, ordinary people waited for the day they could vote in a free election. That day arrived on April 27, 1994. For the first time in South Africa's history, citizens of all races voted together in a democratic national election. Long lines formed outside polling stations before sunrise. Some people waited for hours, smiling, singing, and talking quietly with strangers. Many other South Africans were casting their first vote. The election changed the country forever. The African National Congress won the election, and Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president. His inauguration was attended by leaders from around the world. But the most important people were the millions of South Africans who had made the peaceful transition possible. Mandela knew that winning an election was only the beginning. His government faced enormous challenges: poverty, unemployment, unequal education. And the deep scars of apartheid could not be erased in a few years. Rebuilding trust would take time, patience, and the willingness of ordinary people to move forward together. One of the country's most important steps toward healing came through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The commission gave victims and perpetrators of apartheid violence an opportunity to tell their stories in public. It did not erase the pain of the past, but it offered many South Africans a chance to seek truth and begin the difficult work of reconciliation. The long walk that had begun in a small village and passed through a prison cell had reached the highest office in the land. But Mandela believed that the journey toward justice, equality, and reconciliation belonged to every South African. And that journey was only just beginning. Chapter 6. What remains? Nelson Mandela served as president of South Africa for 5 years. When his term ended in 1999, he chose not to seek a second term. Instead, he returned to private life, continuing to serve his country by promoting peace, education, children's welfare, and the fight against HIV/AIDS. He believed that leadership did not end when a person left office. For many South Africans, Mandela became a symbol of reconciliation. He encouraged people to remember the past without allowing it to destroy the future. His message was not that the pain of apartheid should be forgotten. It was that a nation could only move forward if its people found ways to live together despite the wounds of history. That journey has not been easy. South Africa continues to face challenges such as poverty, unemployment, inequality, and crime. The end of apartheid did not solve every problem. It marked the beginning of a long process of building a more equal society. Mandela often reminded people that freedom comes with responsibility. The future of a nation depends not only on its leaders but also on its citizens. Teachers educating children. Parents raising families. Workers building communities. And young people preparing for tomorrow all have a part to play. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela died at the age of 95. Across South Africa, people gathered to honor his life. Some sang the songs of the struggle. Others stood quietly in reflection. Around the world, millions remember the man whose life had become a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and forgiveness. Today, Mandela's name is known far beyond South Africa. His speeches continue to be studied. His example continues to inspire people working for justice, equality, and human dignity. Yet his greatest legacy cannot be measured by monuments or awards. It lives in every South African who believes that differences can be settled without violence. It lives in every election where citizens choose their leaders through the ballot box. And it lives in every generation that understands freedom is not something one wants, but something protected every day. Nelson Mandela's long walk came to an end. But South Africa's journey continues. And like every great nation, its future will be written not only by those who lead it, but by ordinary people who choose, every day, to build a better tomorrow. That is what remains.